Prime Minister, President, welcome. Thank you for those addresses. Clearly a call to arms, and we can discuss a little bit. But first I want to ask you, there were a couple of applause lines for Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He said, it's neither our wish or our goal to destroy the Transatlantic alliance. So I want to know whether you feel convinced by that, whether you feel that the feathers are being, unruffled after last year's broadside, which was exactly the opposite from the American Speaker, Vice President J.D. Vance.
So I was very much reassured by the speech of the Secretary of State. We know him. He's a good friend, a strong ally. Indeed, this was for me very reassuring to listen to him. We know that in the administration, some have a harsher tone on these topics, but the Secretary of State was very clear. He said, we want a strong Europe in the alliance. And this is what we are working for intensively in the European Union. We have to be an independent Europe, not a Europe that is leaning on someone, but a Europe that is going forward with friends and allies together, facing the challenges that are out there. And therefore, a strong Europe, I completely align with the Secretary of State where that is concerned. But we have to build it. We have to work for it, a strong and independent Europe, to be then a strong ally in NATO, because NATO is consistent then of our friends and allies indeed. But it was also your message. We want a strong Europe. And this is, I think, the message of today, which reflected and was echoed very much in the speech of the Secretary of State.
I thought the Secretary of State's speech was consistent with the argument that Ursula made in her remarks a moment ago and the argument I'm making. I think it's really clear, though, that we shouldn't get in the warm bath of complacency and think that, therefore, all we're really doing is reasserting the continuation of what we've had for the last 80 years. That would be a mistake, and it'd be a particular mistake for Europe, because my strong view is that Europe hasn't done enough in its own defence and security for many years. And the conflict in Ukraine has flushed that out, shown it to be the reality. And it falls to us as leaders to recognise that, to change and strengthen Europe, which is what I'm arguing for, what Ursula is arguing for, and not just say that, but follow it with actions. And Ursula's taken the lead on this. In the work that she's done, particularly on the funding of the defence work that needs to be done, because we will only be able to preserve NATO in the way it is needed for the next 80 years if we change and strengthen the European dimension. That is something which a number of American presidents have said for some time, I believe to be true, and I think we've got to seize this movement to move forward, not to pull apart the transatlantic relationship, but to make sure it works in the circumstances and the times that we face.
Now, I know you want to embrace the United States. You talked about not overly depending, but not also rejecting the US. But you know that the Munich Security Conference doctrine, before this conference began, talked about an era of demolition politics, demolition men, the politics of destruction, etc., including referencing the President of the United States. A very key American former Republican, he calls himself, analyst has said that America is, under Trump, is playing a role of a hostile and possibly predatory power as well. So Europe is caught between a predatory Russia and a potentially predatory United States. Have you internalized that? And is that where you are right now in terms of these fighting words that you've just delivered about pretty much total independence? Do you believe that you are between two predatory powers?
There are more threats. First of all, I would never align Russia with the United States. Completely different theaters. But
these were not my words. These were an analyst.
Yeah, okay. So I would not at all confer with this analyst that there's any equidistance between Russia and the United States, very clearly. But of course, the European Union is challenged with superpowers that are outreaching much more than they used to, and many other threats. And Russia is a real threat to us, without any question. So this is the reason why we have to strengthen our own defense posture, why we have to look into the possibilities that we have, for example, with the Article 42.7, while we have to develop our defense industrial base. So independence is action also to be stronger. This also is on the economic side, very clearly diversifying with like-minded partners. The trade agreement we did with India, the trade agreement we have with Mercosur, so the Latin American countries, Mexico. All this is within a strategy to be more independent, more stronger. And independent means to stand up, develop your own strength, be clear with your own weaknesses. Don't look at others to compensate for your own weaknesses. No, be strong, stand up and develop your own strength, and be open to the world and connect with like-minded partners. And of course, a friend and like-minded partner always has been and is the UK on our continent.
So, Prime Minister, you laid out how Britain has come to the defence and to the joint military action with its allies for a long, long time. But the current Secretary-General of NATO, after Trump's Davos speech, actually after Prime Minister Carney's speech, which talked about a rupture, he said, if you all are thinking that you can do what you have to do without the United States, then dream on. It's not going to happen. So how long do you think it'll take to get to this posture that you both say you need to get to?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we're not looking at a future that tears us apart from the Euro-Atlantic alliance that we have. NATO has been the single most effective and successful military alliance the world has ever known, and we should never move away from it. I often and always base my thinking on what is the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground, so far as the UK is concerned, is we are working with the US on defence, security and intelligence 24/7, every single day. So that is the reality of what is happening. And that is as tight now as it's ever been. And I see no sign of that weakening, nor should it, because that's in the interests of the United Kingdom and the interests of Europe and globally. And that goes into defence, security, intelligence, obviously nuclear capability as well. And therefore, I'm often urged back in my own parliament that we should walk away from what we've got. And I reject that. But I think simply sitting where we are isn't good enough, and therefore the change does need to come. That needs Europe to be stronger, to be working more closely together, and that's why I said what I said about the UK-EU relationship. We're 10 years on from Brexit. We are not the Britain of the Brexit years. We're a Britain that wants to work with the EU even more closely in light of the challenge that we face here 10 years on. That will take time. We are working together. We had a very good UK-EU summit last year. We will have another one this year where we can make further steps forward. But this is of some urgency because I think that on defence and security, until the Ukraine conflict, we didn't really wake up to the reality that we're facing.
And I actually do obviously want to dig into Ukraine because you raised it very clearly towards the beginning of your speech. But you also said, and I want to get to the bottom of this, that some red lines have been crossed and they cannot be uncrossed. You were talking about the United States in your speech, I think. What red lines are you talking about? Because there is a massive deficit of trust between many people in the alliance and certainly leaders who are now having to do what you're doing, workarounds, de-risking, decoupling, whatever you might want to call it, independence. What red lines have been crossed that cannot be uncrossed?
So, for example, I want to be very clear, our digital sovereignty is our digital sovereignty. Very clear on that one. And we have a long tradition in freedom of speech. Actually, the Enlightenment started on our continent. And we are very clear with digital sovereignty also that what is forbidden offline is forbidden online. And we will not flinch what that is concerned. We will be very steadfast to pursue this very clear demand for us. But if I may also look at the quote of the Secretary General of NATO, dream on. I would like to tell him my dear friend, no, my dear friend, there's not only status quo goes on, or division and disruption. There is a lot in between. And status quo is not satisfactory, neither for us, nor for the United States. So there is much more in between. And an independent Europe just means let's develop our strengths without constantly leaning on someone else, and then being strong, moving forward and facing the challenges the world is offering to us. This is what I want to tell my friend Mark Rutte.
Prime Minister, in terms of, President von der Leyen talked about the digital space. That is a red line that cannot be, messed around with. What about the violating international borders space? Do you believe the US threat to Greenland is over? That was a red line for you. It all seemed to stiffen all of your collective spines and you got kind of moving on it. Do you think the threat is over?
Well, I think that, firstly, I'm very pleased that that is now in a process of dialogue, which is where it should have been. The security in the Arctic is really important for all of us, and we need to do more. That's why I announced what I announced about the Carrier Strike Group. I thought that those weeks of Greenland were quite instructive because we had, certainly from the British point of view, the usual mix of common sense, pragmatism, but sticking to our values and principles. And across Europe, we stuck to those values and principles about sovereignty. And why sovereignty matters. And it was a period in which there was intense collaboration and discussion amongst European leaders as to how we would approach the issue. And I was very pleased that we did it in the way that we did. As I say, a mix, as ever, with the Brits of pragmatism and common sense, but with saying these are the lines, these are our principles, these are our values, and that requires us to be absolutely clear about the question of sovereignty. And now it is in a process of discussion and dialogue focused, in my view, where it should be, which is on security in the Arctic, which is a pressing issue and an issue where we all need to do more.
About Ukraine, because, again, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, barely mentioned it except for an elusive peace, he said those words. Now, President Trump has said in his latest comments that Ukraine, President Zelensky needs to get onto it because Russia wants a deal, these are his words, and President Zelensky needs to get onto it right now, otherwise he's going to miss a great opportunity. Secretary Rubio did not go to your meeting, your leaders' meeting with President Zelensky last night. Where do you think this all stands? Where do the negotiations stand? Is it Zelensky who needs to be pressured?
So I think it's extremely important that we do not buy in the Russian narrative. And this has been out too much there. I mean, if we look at the strategic goals and the military goals of Putin, it's a huge failure. He wanted to Russify Ukraine. Ukraine has become European. He wanted to stop NATO. NATO has gotten bigger with Sweden and Finland. He wanted to occupy Ukraine within days or weeks. Well, now we are unfortunately in the 4th year of the war. And I think it is so important that we, on our side, tell the truth, what is going on in Russia, with a war economy, with skyrocketing interest rates and inflation, completely isolated. And now this is a war of attrition. And in this war of attrition, it is of utmost importance that we push forward the negotiations and put pressure on Putin that he finally comes to the negotiation table. And therefore, it was so valuable that we have developed together the security guarantees, the prosperity paper, and are discussing the 20-point plan. Because it is of utmost importance that Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States are on one side of the page, that we are very clear what our standpoint is. This has very much matured, and now it's a matter of putting pressure on Putin that he comes. He avoids, of course, the negotiation table because he does not want to sit down to have peace, which is absolutely abhorrent. So therefore, the pressure we put on him, and the economy is at the limit, is the one way really to make progress in getting to the negotiation table to peace talks.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's very important. In 10 days is the 4-year anniversary of the beginning of the conflict. And it is therefore important to remind ourselves who the aggressor is. The aggressor is Russia. And the quickest way for this conflict to end is for Russia to stop its aggression. And therefore, we're not dealing with two equal parties. There's an aggressor, which is Russia, and there is Ukraine, which has been subject to attack and killing and bombing and taken a huge, or paid a huge price. I agree with Ursula that actually, if you look at the situation on the ground, it was a huge strategic error for Putin. He thought he would take Ukraine in a matter of weeks. And here we are 4 years later, and he has by no means achieved his end, and he has had the opposite effect. The NATO summit last year was the biggest and the strongest, with the greatest resolve for many, many years. So NATO is stronger. Russia's lost, as I mentioned a moment ago, 1 million lives to this conflict. In January this year, I think I'm right in saying 30,000 died on the front line. That is why we're all working for a just and lasting peace. But it will only be just and lasting if the security guarantees, because we've had a cessation of hostilities before, but without anything sitting behind it. And one thing we know about Putin, if nothing sits behind it, he'll go again, which is why we set up the coalition, the Willing, to work on security guarantees. I'm really pleased we're working with the US on that. Actually, another example, whatever words are used by different individuals in different parts of the globe, the practical reality is we're working with the Americans on the security guarantees, and we're more advanced now than we were 3 months ago. And I'm really pleased that we're in a better position.
So I need to ask you a political question, because a lot of people at home are interested. You've just spoken about the amount of money that needs to be spent on the Ukraine defense, on Britain, on Europe. That takes politics and convincing. I want to ask you, do you think you narrowly just miss being toppled? Do you think that what's happening in the politics at home is distracting you and perhaps making you vulnerable to a Brexit follow, the Reform Party, or even maybe the Conservatives, who might not want to pursue the kind of politics that you want to pursue?
No, I reject that. I ended the week much stronger than I started it, and that's a very good place to be. And my party and my government is completely united on the question of Ukraine and defence and security, and the need for stronger relations with Europe on defence, on security, and on economy as well. And so I think that there is real strength in the position I've now set out. I think the whole of the government is united behind that. I think actually it unites across the House of Commons. Not everybody, I accept. Reform have a different agenda. They're pro-Putin. We know where they stand. Imagine if they were in government in the United Kingdom. The coalition of the willing could not exist with UK participation in it. We would not be seen as a leader on the European or international stage. We would be seen as a country that people couldn't do business with. So it's not universal across our parliament, but there's a very strong feeling amongst right-minded politicians that we stick together on Ukraine. When I was in opposition, we supported the then government, a Conservative government, on Ukraine because it was the right thing to do for the values that we uphold. And I'm pleased to say that the Conservative opposition, as it now is, supports the government when it comes to Ukraine, because again, we share the values that underpin it. So for all of the divisions that you never to get in politics, there are some real clarity and some real certainty on these key issues.
Prime Minister Starmer, President von der Leyen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.